You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. We are tackling a massive concept today.
No.
And when I say massive, I don't just mean it's a big topic in the news.
No, this is foundational.
Exactly.
Huh?
It's arguably the operating system of the modern world.
Yeah.
We're talking about democracy. Now, I know what you might be thinking. I know what democracy is. I vote. I watch the news. I complain about politicians.
Sure, that's the surface level.
Right. But today, we're going to strip all that modern noise away. We're going back to the absolute foundations to see if we actually understand the machine we're living inside.
It's essential that we do. Because you're right, the word democracy has become a bit of a buzzword.
It's everywhere.
It is. It's thrown around so loosely in geopolitical speeches and online arguments that it often loses its shape. But in the context we're discussing today, it is not just a slogan. It's number 16.
Number 16, what does that mean?
It is the number 16 great idea among the 102 fundamental concepts that organize the entire Western intellectual tradition. We're analyzing Mortimer Adler's essay on democracy from Volume 1 of The Great Ideas, a syntopicon of great books of the Western world.
Okay, before we dive into the essay itself, we really need to clarify what the syntopicon actually is for people who haven't spent their lives in a library. This isn't just a book, is it? It's more like a map.
That's a perfect description. Imagine a team of scholars spending years reading every major work in Western history. We're talking Homer, Plato, Augustine, Marx, Freud.
The heavy hitters.
All of them, and indexing every single idea, every argument, every connection. The syntopicon is the key to that entire library. It's an index of ideas. And Adler's essay on democracy acts as our tour guide through 2,500 years of debate on this specific topic.
So where does democracy sit on this massive intellectual shelf?
Well, alphabetically, Adler and his team placed it right between definition and desire.
Between definition and desire. That feels strangely poetic, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like democracy is this thing we are constantly struggling to define, but it's also something humanity seems to deeply desire, even when it's messy.
That's a very astute observation, and it actually frames the core tension of Adler's analysis perfectly. He covers the entire sweep of history here, but his main point, the engine that drives this entire essay, is that democracy is not a settled achievement.
Right. We didn't just win it, and now we get to put our feet up.
It's not a participation trophy we can keep on the mantle. Far from it. Adler argues it's an ongoing argument. It's a continuous, often violent debate about human dignity, political possibility, and ultimately whether we can actually pull it off.
And that really is the central conflict we're going to explore today, isn't it? Is democracy actually the best form of government? Or is it inevitably doomed to degenerate into mob rule?
And the most important question.
And maybe the scariest question of all. Can we, as regular people, actually handle the responsibility it demands of us?
That is the question that has haunted political philosophy for 2,500 years.
So let's unpack this beast. Part 1, defining it. Adler makes a distinction right out of the gate that, I'll be honest, it sort of threw me for a loop. We usually think of democracy as voting, but Adler says that's way, way too narrow.
It is. If you just look at the mechanics, you miss the soul of the thing. Adler distinguishes between democracy as a form of government, which is the legal structure, the voting booths, the Constitution.
The hardware, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it. And he contrasts that with democracy as a social condition.
A social condition. So the vibe of the society, the software.
In a way, yes. It's about equality. But Adler breaks this down into 3 distinct types, and this is crucial for understanding the disagreements we see today. You have political equality, which is your suffrage, your right to vote.
Okay, that's the one we all know.
Then you have economic equality, which is about the distribution of wealth and opportunity. And then you have social equality.
What does social equality look like in practice? Because that sounds a lot harder to legislate.
It is. Social equality is about the culture. It's about how we treat one another when the law isn't looking. Is there a hierarchy of deference? Do you have to bow to the squire when he walks past, or do we look each other in the eye as equals?
I see.
Adler points out that you can have a society where everyone votes, so you have political democracy, but if the culture is incredibly rigid, class-based, and snobbish, it doesn't feel democratic.
That's a huge distinction. It's like you can have a diverse boardroom on paper, but if nobody actually listens to the new person because they went to a state school, is it really an open environment?
Precisely. And Adler points out that the word democracy changes its meaning radically depending on which of those 3 you're emphasizing. If you talk to a classical liberal, they are hyper-focused on the political machinery and individual rights.
Right. the rules of the game.
But if you talk to a socialist, as Adler outlines, they're focused on the economic conditions. They would argue you can't be politically equal if you're starving.
We are absolutely going to get deep into that friction later because that is basically the story of the 20th century. But first, we have to deal with another distinction Adler makes, the difference between constitutional government and democracy. I think most people today use those terms interchangeably.
They do, and it causes a lot of confusion. Historically, they're very different concepts. We have to go back to the Greeks for this. Think of Solon in Athens, or Lycurgus in Sparta. These were the great lawgivers. They invented the idea of constitutional government.
Let's stick with Solon for a second, because the story of Solon is wild. Athens was on the brink of civil war, right? The poor were literally in debt bondage to the rich.
It was a crisis point. The rich owned everything, the land, the power. And the poor were literally selling themselves and their children into slavery to pay off debts. Solon was brought in as a mediator to fix it, and he established a constitution.
So what's the core definition of that, of constitutional government?
The core definition is a system where citizens are free and equal, and they rule and are ruled in turn.
Rule and are ruled in turn. I've always loved that phrasing. It implies a cycle. You aren't just a subject obeying a king, you're a participant. Today you might be on the jury, tomorrow you might be the defendant.
Or today you're the mayor, and tomorrow you're just a citizen again. It's designed to eliminate a permanent ruling class. But here's the catch, and it's a massive one. In the ancient view, who counted as a citizen?
A very specific, very small VIP section.
Exactly. Free adult males, usually those with property or military standing. So you had constitutional government, meaning the rule of law applied to those inside the club, but you did not have democracy. The vast majority of the population, women, slaves, foreigners, the poor, were completely excluded.
So the modern shift, the thing that makes it democracy with a capital D, isn't the rule of law itself. It's the expansion of that circle.
It's universal suffrage. That is the dividing line.
So the analogy, okay, it's like a private country club. Inside the club, everyone is equal. They all vote on the dinner menu. They all follow the club rules. Nobody's the king of the club. That's constitutional government.
A perfect analogy.
But 90% of the town is standing outside in the rain, looking through the window.
Yes. And for thousands of years, political philosophy was mostly about how to best run the club for the people inside it.
And democracy is what happens when you finally unlock the front door and let the people from the rain come inside and sit at the table.
And that opening of the doors changes everything. It changes the dynamic of the room. It changes the noise level. And that's why this essay connects to so many other great ideas in the Syntopicon. You can't talk about democracy without talking about the citizen, about constitution, about liberty, justice, and equality.
They're all interwoven.
Adler frames this as a great conversation. He's not just giving us a dictionary definition. He's showing us how these ideas talk to each other and argue with each other across the centuries.
So let's listen in on that conversation. Let's go back to the roots, part 2, the ancient roots and the critics. We mentioned Athens. We always hear Athens as the cradle of democracy.
Yeah.
But what did it actually look like on a Tuesday?
It was radical, and frankly, it was chaotic. In Athens, you had direct citizen participation. They didn't elect a representative to go to the Capitol and vote for them.
They were the government.
They were. 6,000 men gathering on a hill, the Phalanx, shouting, debating, and voting directly on whether to go to war or build a temple.
No filibusters, no committees, just the people and the vote.
Right. And while that sounds very romantic to us now, it terrified a lot of very smart thinkers at the time. This brings us to the heavyweight champion of anti-democratic thought, Plato.
Plato, the man who wrote the Republic. He wasn't just a critic. You could argue he was the first and most articulate troll of democracy.
He was the most famous ancient critic, certainly. And you have to understand, Plato looked at democracy and saw the very mechanism that killed his teacher, Socrates.
That's right. I always forget that. A democratic jury voted to execute the wisest man in Athens.
So Plato had a very personal vendetta against the wisdom of the crowds. He saw it fail in the most spectacular and tragic way possible.
That definitely puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
So what was his actual argument against it, beyond the personal?
He used the famous analogy of the ship of state. He said, imagine you are on a ship in a violent storm. Who do you want steering the vessel? Do you want the passengers to all get together and vote on which way to turn the wheel?
Well, no. Obviously, you want the captain if the passengers vote, we're probably going to hit an iceberg.
Exactly. Plato believed governance was a skill, a techne, like medicine or navigation. It required knowledge and expertise. He thought the masses fundamentally lacked the wisdom to govern. He argued that in a democracy, people mistake liberty for license.
Explain that difference.
Yeah.
License meaning just I can do whatever I want rather than I am free to do what is right.
Precisely. It's freedom without responsibility or wisdom. Plato feared the mob. He described the public as a great beast, a large, powerful, but ultimately irrational animal. The politicians in a democracy, he said, aren't leaders. They are just the people who have learned how to pet the beast and feed it whatever it wants.
So the politician just says, hey, beast, you want lower taxes and more spending at the same time, you got it. It's the candy for dinner platform.
It is short-term gratification over long-term health, always. And Plato thought this process inevitably degenerates into tyranny. Eventually, the mob creates so much chaos and disorder that they become desperate for order at any cost. And a strong man, a demagogue, steps in, claims to speak for the people, and seizes total power.
That's a terrifyingly cyclical view of history.
Yeah.
And it feels a little too relevant sometimes. But Aristotle, his student, was a bit more nuanced, wasn't he? He didn't hate it quite as much.
Aristotle was always more pragmatic, more of a biologist, classifying things as he saw them. He distinguished between what he called a polity, which was a moderate form of constitutional government, and extreme democracy.
Okay, what's the difference for him?
For Aristotle, it came down to two things: the rule of law and the intent of the rulers. In a polity, the citizens, even the poor majority, rule for the common good. In an extreme democracy, the poor rule solely for their own interest, ignoring the rights of the wealthy and the good of the state as a whole.
So for Aristotle, it wasn't just about the structure, it was about the virtue of the people involved.
That is the key word: virtue. Aristotle believed democracy could only work if the citizens possessed civic virtue, if they were educated, if they had a stake in the outcome, and if they cared about the whole, not just their own pockets.
Which is a very high bar. It demands a lot from the average person.
Mm.
Okay, so moving forward on the timeline, we go from Greece to Rome, part 3, evolution of the idea. Rome wasn't a democracy in the Athenian sense, it was a republic.
Correct. The Romans were very skeptical of the Athenian mob. Their great contribution, championed by thinkers like Cicero, was the concept of mixed government.
Right, mixing the ingredients.
Exactly. They looked at the three classic forms of government: rule by one, monarchy; rule by the few, aristocracy; and rule by the many, democracy. They thought every one of these, on its own, has a fatal flaw. Monarchy becomes tyranny. Aristocracy becomes oligarchy. Democracy becomes mob rule. So why choose? Let's combine them.
The first real system of checks and balances.
The prototype of it, yes. The Roman Republic had consuls, which is the monarchical element. They had a senate, the aristocratic element. And they had popular assemblies, the democratic element. They were all designed to lock each other in place so no single group could dominate the state.
And the glue holding it all together was the law.
Yes. Cicero argued that a true republic requires popular consent, but it must be governed by the rule of law, not the arbitrary will of a person or a crowd. For Cicero, the law is king.
Then Rome falls. The lights go out in the West, so to speak. And we hit the Middle Ages. And from what I recall in my history classes, democracy kind of takes a long nap here.
In practice, yes. It largely disappears as a functioning system. You have kings, you have the church, you have a rigid feudal system. But, and this is where Adler's essay is so illuminating, the theory didn't die. It evolved underground in a very unlikely place.
Which was where?
Theology.
Theology. That seems completely counterintuitive. The church is the definition of a hierarchy. How do you possibly get democracy out of that?
It comes through the concept of natural law, which was brilliantly synthesized by Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, hold on. Natural law is one of those terms people drop at dinner parties to sound smart, but I'm never entirely sure what it actually means. It's not just the laws of physics, right?
Think of it like moral physics. Aquinas, building on Aristotle, argued that just as there are physical laws that govern the motion of planets, there are moral laws that govern human nature. These laws come from God, they are woven into the fabric of reality, and, this is the crucial part, they are accessible to human reason.
So you don't need a king to tell you what's right or wrong. You can figure it out because you're a rational human being created in God's image.
Exactly, and because this natural law is higher than any human law, it places a limit on earthly power. If a king makes a law that violates natural law, say, a law that commands you to murder an innocent person, that law is invalid. It's not a law at all. It's an act of violence.
So the king isn't the ultimate authority. His power isn't absolute.
No, he is under God's law.
Ah.
And this planted a radical seed. The idea that the legitimacy of a government doesn't come from the king's bloodline or the size of his army. It comes from whether his laws align with justice. This laid the intellectual groundwork for the idea of consent.
I see.
Even if feudalism blocked it in reality for centuries, the logical foundation was being built.
That's the bridge. That gets us to part 4, the modern explosion, the social contract. This is where the theory breaks out of the monasteries and the libraries and starts toppling thrones.
This is the definitive shift to consent. We're talking about the giants, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, the era of the social contract.
Let's talk about John Locke first, because his fingerprints are all over the American system. If you read the Declaration of Independence, you're basically reading a cover of a John Locke song.
Absolutely. Locke argued that in a state of nature, before any governments existed, we were all free and equal. We possess natural rights, life, liberty, and property. But the state of nature is insecure. Stronger people can steal your stuff or harm you.
It's dangerous.
Very. So we come together and we form a contract, we agree to create a government, and we hire it to do one primary job: protect our rights.
It's a business deal. I give up a little bit of my absolute freedom, like the freedom to drive 100 miles an hour down the street, and in exchange, the government provides roads and police to ensure nobody steals my car.
Exactly. And the revolutionary kicker is this. If the government fails to protect those rights, or even worse, starts violating them itself, the contract is broken. The people have the right to fire that government.
The right to revolution.
The right to revolt, which was treasonous talk at the time. It was the intellectual ammunition for the American Revolution.
But then you have Rousseau, who takes it even further. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's sort of the moody, romantic radical of the group.
He is. Rousseau was the general will guy, and I always found this concept a little slippery.
It is slippery, and it can be interpreted in dangerous ways. Rousseau believed that representative government, the Lockean model where you elect someone to vote for you, was a form of slavery. He famously said the English are only free on election day. The moment they cast their ballot, they are enslaved again because they've handed their will over to someone else. So what was his alternative?
He wanted the citizens to be the lawmakers. He believed true democracy requires citizens to actively participate in creating the laws they must then obey. This collective desire for the common good is what he called the general will.
That sounds great in a small Swiss village. But how on earth do you do that in a nation of millions? You can't fit everyone in the assembly hall.
That is the problem of scale, and that brings us directly to the American experiment. The founders, people like Madison and Hamilton, had read all these guys. They knew the history of Athens, they knew Plato's fear of the mob, but they also believed in Locke's idea of consent.
So they had to engineer a solution that took the best of both worlds.
They turned to the Federalists' solution, representative democracy.
Which is, at its heart, a filter.
Yes. In the Federalist Papers, specifically number 10, Madison argues that you want to filter the will of the people. He was terrified of majority tyranny. He knew that if you have a pure democracy, 51% of the people can vote to take away the property of the 49%.
Or vote to suppress a religion they don't like.
Right. So by having elected representatives, you hopefully get a group of people who are cooler-headed, more reflective, who can take the time to refine the public views. It deliberately slows the process down. It forces compromise.
So it's a buffer zone against the heat of the moment. It's almost designed to be inefficient, in a way.
Yeah, precisely. It trades speed for safety. And we can't talk about American democracy without mentioning Alexis de Tocqueville. The brilliant Frenchman who came over in the 1830s looked around and wrote Democracy in America.
I love Tocqueville because he writes like a travel blogger who also happens to be a genius sociologist. He noticed things the Americans missed because they were just too close to it.
And his observations are critical to Adler's essay. Tocqueville didn't just see a political system when he came here. He saw that social condition we talked about at the very beginning. He called it equality of conditions.
What did he mean by that?
He saw that in America, unlike in Europe, people shook hands. They looked each other in the eye. There was no inherited aristocracy you had to bow to. There was a sense that any person could, through hard work, achieve success.
But he was worried about it too, wasn't he?
He was. He saw it as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought incredible social mobility and civic engagement. But on the other hand, he feared it would lead to a kind of mediocrity.
The pressure to conform, to fit in.
Yes. The tyranny of the majority, in a social sense. He worried that if everyone is equal, then anyone who stands out intellectually or culturally is viewed with suspicion. Who do you think you are? He worried democracy would flatten everything out, creating a comfortable but ultimately bland society where nobody dares to be great.
That is a fascinating tension. We want equality, but we don't want to be generic. We want to be part of the group, but we don't want to lose our individuality.
And that tension is still very much alive today.
Okay, we are going to take a quick pause here. We've covered the history, the definitions, and the initial explosion of the idea. But when we come back, we are going to dive into the fights, the big debates that are still raging today, political versus economic rights, the battle for suffrage, and the ultimate safeguard that Adler says is the only thing keeping the whole system from collapsing.
It gets really interesting from here.
Stay with us. Before we jump back into the arena of ideas, let's take a second to breathe. If you are enjoying this deep dive, you are clearly someone who values understanding the world on a deeper level. You aren't satisfied with just the headlines, you want the footnotes. We think you should check out Mindful Moments. It's our YouTube channel. It's dedicated to exactly this kind of content AI, book analysis, summaries, and critiques. It's really designed to inspire reflection and rational thought in a world that is often moving way too fast for either. It's nourishment for your mind. So check it out. Okay, we are back. We are analyzing Mortimer Adler's comprehensive essay on democracy. We have defined it. We have traced it from Athens to America. Now it's time for part 5. The Great Debates.
This is where Adler Syntopicon really shines as a tool. He doesn't just list historical facts, he sets up the conflicting arguments and lets them fight it out. He treats the great books like a giant, centuries-long dinner party where everyone is arguing.
And the first argument is a heavy hitter: democracy and truth.
This is the relativism debate. The core question is this: does the will of the people make something right? Or can the people be wrong?
Right. So if 51% of the people vote that the Earth is flat, does that make the Earth flat?
In a physical sense, obviously not. But in a moral or political sense, that is the real question. The absolutist position, which traces all the way back to Plato, says that truth is objective. There is a right answer to how to run a society. Justice is a real thing, like a mathematical proof.
And since there's a right answer?
Because there is a right answer, the people who know that answer, the elites, the experts, the philosopher kings, they should be the ones to rule.
It's the ship of state again. Why let the ignorant people vote for the wrong answer? If you know 2 + 2 is 4, why would you let the people vote on whether it equals 5?
Exactly. That's the technocratic argument in a nutshell. But the Democrats' response is fascinating. They argue that even if objective truth exists, elites are fallible. Kings go mad. Dictators get greedy. Experts have blind spots and biases. No single human being can be trusted with absolute power to decide the truth for everyone else.
So democracy isn't about being perfect. It's about being correctable.
Yes, that is the key. It offers a peaceful way to correct errors. If the people make a mistake, and they will, they can vote to fix it in the next election. It's a self-correcting system. If a king makes a mistake, you usually have to start a war or a revolution to fix it.
That's a very pragmatic defense. It's not the people are always right. It's more like the people are the safest place to park the ultimate power.
Well said.
Now, let's move to the tension that defines so much of the 20th century and still defines our politics today: political versus economic democracy.
This is crucial, and we need to spend some real time here. This is the fundamental split between the liberal democracy view and the socialist or Marxist view. And Adler lays this out very clearly and neutrally.
So the core question is it enough to have the right to vote if you're starving?
Right. The liberal democracy view, generally speaking, argues that political equality is the foundation. One person, one vote. The rule of law, equal protection. They argue that economic inequality is acceptable and maybe even necessary for innovation, as long as there is equal opportunity and the game is fundamentally fair.
Their argument is that liberty is the priority. If I am free to work, free to trade, and free to keep what I earn, some people will inevitably end up with more than others. But as long as no one coerced me, that's a fair outcome.
Correct. They would say that trying to force economic equality usually ends up destroying political liberty. To make everyone have the same amount of money, the government needs immense power to take and redistribute. And that power, historically, becomes tyrannical.
Okay, now let's steelman the other side. What is the socialist critique of that?
The socialist view, as Adler summarizes it, argues that political democracy is hollow without economic democracy. They would ask, what good is the freedom of speech if the newspapers and TV stations are all owned by 5 billionaires?
Or, what good is the right to property if you have no money to buy anything?
Exactly. They are arguing that money is power. They argue that significant economic inequality inevitably corrupts the political process. If one person is rich enough to hire an army of lobbyists and another person is poor enough that he has to work 3 jobs and has no time for politics, then they are not political equals. The game is already rigged.
Rousseau actually touched on this too, didn't he? Way before Marx.
He did. He had a very famous line. He said that for a democracy to work, no citizen should be rich enough to be able to buy another, and none so poor as to be forced to sell himself.
It is a powerful standard, and I don't think any modern society has solved that tension. We're still arguing about campaign finance, lobbying, and wealth gaps.
We absolutely haven't solved it. It is the central tension of modern democracy. How do you balance the liberty to get rich with the equality needed for citizens to respect each other as peers?
Then there's the other big battle, the suffrage battle. The long, hard fight over who is a citizen.
Adler notes the progression here, and it's a slow, grinding expansion. First, it was propertyless men who were excluded.
Which was a huge fight in itself. We tend to forget that.
A huge fight. The argument was, if you don't own land, you don't have a real stake in the country, you're transient, you'll just vote to steal from the landowners.
Then, of course, it was the fight for women's suffrage.
And then for racial minorities.
And Adler points out a disturbing pattern here, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that every single time suffrage was about to expand to a new group, the critics used the exact same argument.
Which one?
They lack the capacity. When it was propertyless men, the argument was they aren't educated enough to vote responsibly. When it was women, they said they are too emotional, their sphere is the home, they can't understand politics. When it was minorities, they said they aren't culturally ready.
It's always an argument about competence. It's always, we can't let them into the club, they'll ruin it.
And every single time, history proved the critics wrong. The expansion of suffrage didn't collapse the state, it strengthened it. It made the base of the pyramid wider and more stable. But, and this is a big but, the argument about capacity isn't entirely baseless. It leads us directly to Adler's most urgent point in the entire essay.
And that's part 6, education. Adler seems to think this is the ultimate safeguard, the one non-negotiable element.
This is where Adler stops being just a historian and starts issuing a stark warning to us. He argues that democracy faces a constant existential threat. And it's not foreign invasion, it's not even economic collapse.
This is internal rot.
It is when citizens become objects of propaganda.
That phrase chills me every time I read it. Objects of propaganda. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. What does that mean to him?
It means you are no longer an active subject, a thinker. You are a passive thing to be manipulated, a data point to be targeted. If you don't think for yourself, if you can't analyze an argument, if you can't spot a logical fallacy, then you are just a tool for someone else's ambition.
So if you're just parroting what you heard on cable news or reposting a meme because it made you angry without actually processing the truth of it, you aren't really a democratic citizen in that moment. You're a puppet.
Exactly. You are being steered. And that is why Adler and Jefferson and Mill, long before him, argued that education is not a luxury in a democracy. It is an absolute prerequisite.
Jefferson talked about the need for public enlightenment.
Yes. His logic was simple. If the power resides with the people must be enlightened. Otherwise, you just have that great beast of Plato's just smashing things blindly.
Adler has this great line that really stuck with me. Philosophy is everybody's business.
He truly believed that. He didn't think philosophy was for professors in tweed jackets and ivory towers. He thought every plumber, every nurse, every bus driver needed to be able to appraise issues for themselves. They needed the tools of logic and critical thinking to be free.
Because in a democracy, the bus driver and the philosophy professor have the exact same amount of power in the voting booth.
Correct. And if the bus driver is an object of propaganda, or if the professor is, for that matter, the democracy itself fails.
This feels incredibly, almost painfully relevant to our modern algorithm-driven age. Adler was writing decades before the internet, but he saw the mechanism.
He saw that if a society begins to value rhetoric, persuasion, emotional manipulation over truth, it's in deep trouble. Plato feared the sophists, the smooth-talking guys who can argue any side of an issue for money. Today, we have algorithms that do that on a global scale. They're designed to feed you what confirms your bias. They're designed to keep you angry, to keep you clicking.
It replays Plato's fear of rhetoric over truth, but on a digital planetary scale.
It does.
Yeah.
And the only defense is the disciplined mind of the individual citizen. You have to be able to stop and ask, wait a minute, is this true? Or is this just designed to make me mad?
So where does all of this leave us? Part 7, why this matters. Adler's synthesis.
Well, Adler is a realist, but he is also an optimist in the end. He identifies genuine progress in this great conversation.
We have come a long way from Athens. We aren't executing our philosophers for the most part.
We have. Universal suffrage is a massive historical achievement. Constitutional protections for minorities, however imperfectly applied, are real. And the realization that democracy is a way of life, as Tocqueville said, is deep in our bones now. We expect to be treated with a certain dignity.
But there are still unresolved tensions. We haven't reached the end of history.
Always. Liberty versus equality, that's the eternal seesaw. How much equality can we have before we start to crush liberty? How much liberty can we have before inequality becomes so vast that it's unbearable and unjust? Democracy isn't a solved puzzle. It's the art of balancing on that fulcrum.
And what about efficiency versus participation?
Right. Dictatorships are efficient. One guy decides, and it happens. The trains run on time, as they say. Democracy is messy, it's slow, it involves endless meetings and debates and compromises that leave everyone a little unhappy. The question is, are we willing to pay the price of that inefficiency to keep our freedom?
So what's the real takeaway here? For the person listening to this while they commute or do the dishes, what's the one thing they should hold on to?
The takeaway is that democracy isn't a machine you can just turn on and leave alone. It requires constant maintenance. And the maintenance crew is us.
It requires intellectual independence.
Yes. Understanding these debates, Plato versus Aristotle, Locke versus Rousseau, this isn't just history trivia. This is your toolkit. These are the diagnostic tools you need to look at the news today and say, wait a minute, that argument sounds like mob rule, or that policy sounds like tyranny disguised as safety.
It's what stops you from becoming an object of propaganda.
It restores your dignity as a citizen. You become an active participant in the great conversation, not just a passive spectator watching it all burn.
That is a powerful thought.
It's the number 16 great idea for a reason. It is the idea that, for all its flaws, trusts us with our own destiny.
So as we wrap up, here's a final provocative thought that Adler leaves us with.
Adler suggests that the reduction of the citizen to an object of propaganda is the single greatest danger to democracy. So the question for you, for all of us, is this. Are we currently living as active citizens, thinking critically, questioning our own biases? Or are we allowing ourselves to become objects of propaganda? Are we steering the ship, or are we just cargo, drifting with the currents?
That is something to chew on.
Indeed.
If you want to dive deeper into this, click the link on screen for more on this and other essay subjects. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.